Chapter 26 of 80 Years Ashore and Afloat, or The Thrilling Adventures of Uncle Jethro by E.C. Cornell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26, A Voyage to Labrador in Sloop Hero. Started for Boston May 1st with 8 men and a boy, to fit for a fishing voyage, and in a few days put to sea. Our first landfall was Gabarus, Cape Breton, where we dropped anchor on account of bad weather and headwinds. A boat containing a man shoved off to us. He had with him a bag of young pigs which were offered for sale. As we did not care for them, declined to purchase, but after considerable talk he was offered and gladly accepted half a bushel of meal for 2 of them, and told us to take more of them if we desired. I told him 2 were as many as I knew what to do with. He put them on board, the boy placed them in a barrel, and was ordered to take care of them. Sometimes we would give them fresh fish. They enjoyed stripping it up and throve nicely. We had a good run, made a stop at Bay of Islands, procured wood, water, boat spars, etc., and continued the passage, arriving at Brader Gulch, where our fishing was to be prosecuted. We were quite successful during the season. The latter part of June had a visit from a gentleman residing by a neighboring harbor. He said he had noticed we had pigs running around on the rocks on shore and was very desirous of buying them. He said he wanted them dreadfully. We refused to let them go, for on the 4th of July we intended to celebrate, and the pigs were to be butchered for the dinner. On the first day of the month, myself, with a number of the men having some business to transact with the gentleman alluded to, we went to his house. Found him with his wife at home. I happened to be seated near the outer door, alone, while the others were together on the opposite side of the room. The lady came along and took a seat by me, and commenced to speak of matters and things in general, but I perceived she had something on her mind of more than ordinary interest. Directly, in a quiet and subdued voice, bending her form most gracefully to me, she attempted to give utterance to the burden of her heart. Just think of the painful suspense in that moment of seeming inability to control her emotions or express her longing desires. Taking a long breath, the tremulous lips began to move, and with her bright eyes resting on mine, hardly less brilliant, just about that time, she broke forth. "Mister, ain't you the man that owns the pigs?" I told her that I was. "Well," said she, "I do want them dreadfully. I will pay you any price for them." I told her that I could not think of disposing of them, that we anticipated having a general good time on the 4th of July, and must have the pigs for our dinner. "Oh," said she, "it is too cruel to kill those little hogs, and I do want them so badly." I saw that I should be unable to prevail against such pleadings, and finally, with considerable reluctance, gave way with a promise that she might have one if she was so much in want of one. But still I found her only partially satisfied. Once more she turned to me and very naturally asked if they were not of different sexes. I replied that they were. "Is it not then best to let me have them both, and not destroy the family relation?" At last, finding her not to be put off, I agreed. If she would pay the boy $2 for his care of them, she might have them, as I did not wish to speculate in pigs, and was not anxious to make anything out of them. Her countenance was radiant, and she gave me such a smile of gratitude that I was glad I let her have them, although no doubt if she had not been an exceedingly handsome lady, we should have eaten them as we had hoped to. For this act of kindness I was severely censured when I returned to the vessel and informed the crew of what I had done, one going so far as threatened to inform the owners that I had sold the vessel's provision for speculative purposes. I told him the trouble would be saved him. When we arrived at home, I told the circumstances to Mr. Timothy Coffin, our owner, and he said he wished I had taken all the pigs down and given them away. In the fall, saw the pigs. They had grown nicely, and I tried to buy them of the lady again. She said I hadn't enough money on board the vessel to tempt her to part with them. These were the first pigs ever introduced there, and I afterwards learned that they became quite plentiful. Our fish were now sold, with the exception of about 80 quintals, still awaiting a fair day to complete the drying. A spell of wet easterly weather hung on, and finally concluded the vessel in waiting had better proceed on her voyage, and we would take the fish on board our vessel and start for home. We did so with a fair wind the following morning. In the afternoon it commenced to blow. At 4 o'clock I took the helm, and, the gale increasing, the vessel was brought to scudding under a square sail. 11 hours it had been blowing, and the sea was extremely dangerous. When my trick at the wheel was up, could find none who dared relieve me. They claimed that, as I was more accustomed to the vessel, it was unsafe to trust her with anyone else, for fear that she might broach to when it would be all up with us. 19 hours I remained without a spell, occasionally taking a mouthful of grub or a hasty drink as I could catch it. After it moderated, gave up the helm. We're now off Codroy Harbor, which we entered, and for a number of blowy days lay at our anchors. I told our folks it would be best to secure the ballast by flooring over with boards, to prevent it from shifting in case of more rugged weather, which we might reasonably look for before getting home. They all preferred to go out gunning, and did so. During their absence, I went into the hold, laid a floor, and with the spurs stanchioned down solid, made it quite secure. But for fear the stanchions between the deck and flooring might work loose with the motion of the vessel, I cut hinges from the legs of old boots and nailed them to the heads of the posts and to the deck as a preventive. The wind came fair, and we made sail, shaping our course for Scattery, a 90 miles run. With a fair wind and plenty of it, we were going off a pretty good jog. It began to blow still harder and thicken up, and there was every appearance of a southeaster. Not long were we in forming the conclusion that sail must be reduced and the vessel hove to. Now we wished we had more sea room. We wore ship and headed off on the starboard tack. In place of the mainsail, set the trysail with the jib reefed. Soon had to take in the jib, and it had become dangerous to longer remain on deck. Lashed the helm to the lee, and all hands went below and closed the gangway slide. It was a hard old night. A sea would strike and heave her lee rail all under. Some of us looked rather pale in the vicinity of the gills, somewhat fearful of the ballast shifting. It was a queer-looking group, seated on the cabin floor during that tempestuous night. I told them there was much more danger to be apprehended from what lay to leeward of us than from the ballast in our hold. We only had 40 miles driftway before we should be piled up on the shore, where the coast was rock-bound, in some places more than 500 feet high. The next forenoon the wind suddenly changed to the opposite direction, blowing a gale from that quarter, but still we did not dare to run. Laid to 12 hours for the sea to get regulated, and then put her before it, under the sail we had hove to under. Had a good passage the rest of the way home, arriving the 1st of September. I remained about home for some time, occupying myself in various ways, sometimes by short trips on the water or lumping along shore. I took 2 more voyages to the Straits, which I shall slightly allude to. My usual occupation, on land for more than 30 years, was the fitting of rigging on board wrecked vessels, and for the fleet of whalers then owned by our citizens. There were 3 of us who were in the gang, a Mr. Godfrey, acting as our boss until his death when I took the position, though Mr. G. had never been in the habit of cutting a gang of rigging without consulting me. Mr. Collins was our 3rd man until quite a number of years since, previous, however, to the decease of our boss, when a Mr. Courtney, a retired whaleman, lent us his assistance. Mr. C. was one of the best whalemen that ever went in the head of a boat, and had the satisfaction of seeing thick blood flow a great many times under the accuracy of his aim. And even now it is somewhat amusing to listen to his bloody stories of ugly whales and how they were at last forced to surrender. It rarely happens that he spends an evening in a crowd, but that several voyages are made and enough oil taken to supply a pretty quick market. Not only did I find employment as rigger, but in a general way performed a little of all sorts relating to fitting away ships or stripping them on their return, or sometimes acting as oil watcher at night. Also assisted in breaking out the cargo, etc., etc. Anything which offered which was remunerative and respectable. Many accidents have attended me during my experience since I left a regular seafaring life. More than once I have missed my footing and come from aloft much quicker than I went up, yet through the kindness of a watchful Providence have escaped without any permanent injury to limb or disfiguring of features. Am still able to walk erect and enjoy the gratifying reflection that I'm really not bad looking for a man of 80. Not a great many years ago, while engaged in fitting the rigging on board a vessel, a rope above me parted, letting a large-sized hoisting block plump upon my head. 2 hours after, the same thing was repeated, and yet I sustained my senses, though for a while in both instances I saw stars distinctly. Not a few times have I barely escaped with my life from similar accidents, besides the capsizing of boats and a general variety of mishaps incidental to an individual's destined to be always in harm's way. About 3 years ago, a little incident happened, so out of the regular course of things, and the means of restoring myself being strictly original and withal not extremely expensive, I think it best for the benefit of my hearers and of mankind generally to speak of it. I was at work by the day on a ship fitting for a whaling voyage. As was our usual custom, at noon all hands knocked off and went for our dinners. For the want of anything better, my good woman had fried some bacon. Somewhat hungry, for hard work will most always make persons so, seated myself, and doubtless displayed some eagerness in putting my allowance away. Not having a great many teeth with which to chew my food, and as I have since discovered, but a very diminutive swallow. In the act of taking a piece of meat, it became fixed in the throat so tightly that it was very much feared I should strangle myself. A person was dispatched with all haste for Professor Mayberry, one of our eminent M.D.s of our village. He arrived, and considering it quite essential to provide himself with some surgical instruments, in order to relieve me from my critical condition, returned to his office less than half a mile distant. In the meantime, I became somewhat impatient, for although the doctor was not gone long, it seemed to me an age, and at last I became so exasperated that I took a long, slender stick, split the end, picked up a dirty piece of rag that happened to be lying round loose, drew a part into the stick, winding a quantity over the end, and then leading the outer end to the end of the stick that was to be held in my hand. I gave it a desperate shove. The meat went down, and I got up. Did not stop to finish the dinner, but took my hat and started for the ship. Met the doctor on his way, when I told him it was so near 1 o'clock, the turning on time where I worked, that I couldn't stop any longer for him. Went to work as usual. Since that time, when strangling, I always use the same means and do not send for the doctor. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of 80 Years Ashore and Afloat, or The Thrilling Adventures of Uncle Jethro by E.C. Cornell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. One of the Voyages 40 years ago. You will pardon me, my friends, for passing over 2 voyages to Labrador, which should have been noticed earlier in this narrative, having been accomplished 40 years ago, more or less. One of these voyages was in a miserable old hulk without sails and rigging, just fit for old junk. As usual, went to Boston for our supplies, etc., with a crew of 9 men. Had a common passage, nothing remarkable occurring as far as Canso, near Halifax. The wind then came ahead and rain set in. The mainsail became very heavy and sagged so that the bolt rope parted, and down it came, leaving a foot or 2 of the sail aloft with the gaff. Sent them down, and mended the sail as best we could before running it up again. The rain changed to a thick fog, and we thought best to endeavor to find a harbor. We knew hardly anything in regard to the lay of the land, knew not any place convenient for our purpose, but kept along maintaining a good lookout. Soon land hove in sight close aboard of us, right ahead. Tacked ship, stood to the wind south, and directly land was ahead and under our lee. It appeared that by some means we had entered a river. Made short tacks until a ledge of rocks directly ahead and in the middle of the passage caused us to let go the anchor. The shore was not in sight now, so dense was the fog. It was high water. We went below and made a good fire to dry and warm ourselves. Not a great while after, a boat came alongside, in which was a gentleman who asked where we were from. We told him we were from Boston, had been in about 1 hour. He thought we must have had an excellent pilot, could not conceive how we had been able to enter the river at all, so thickly were rocks and shoals scattered about. He remarked that he had lived in this vicinity 30 years, and never before had he seen a vessel in there. He was more than surprised when, in reply to a question, we told him we had not grounded nor struck a rock. I thought then if we had been in some nice vessel we should not have fared so well. But the old hulk was not worth pounding against rocks. This man was a pilot along the coast, but he acknowledged that with his experience and knowledge of the river he could not have succeeded as well as we in our ignorance had done. I thought the poet was perfectly correct when he wrote, "When ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise." We waited 3 days for an opportunity to be taken out. The pilot started with us on about 3/4 tide, as in case we lodged on the rocks, full tide would lift us clear. The name of the harbor was Peter the Great, lying north-northeast from Canso Light, 30 or 40 miles distant. We continued on our voyage, which was successfully accomplished without anything transpiring worthy of note, except our safe arrival at home, where we remained through the winter, starting the following spring on another trip in the good old brig Planter. Our brig was under the command of Thomas Fisher, with a crew of 12 men and a boy. Had a favorable run to the gut of Canso, which divides Cape Breton from Nova Scotia. We made the ice, and for security went into the harbor of Jethro. In a few days had company by the arrival of another fishing vessel. From the extremely friendly relations existing between her commander and our own, we judged them members of the same Masonic fraternity, which subsequently proved correct. The ice was from 3 to 4 feet thick, and from Newfoundland across to where we lay, one field of ice stretched out before the eye. We had waited some time for it to clear out. One afternoon the captain of the other vessel came on board. Our skipper said to Captain Casno, "How long do you think it will be before this ice melts or goes out so that we can proceed on our voyage?" He replied that if we waited for it to melt or break up, we should get no opportunity for fishing during the season. That, to me, was anything but an agreeable feature, but soon he somewhat alleged my apprehensions by stating that in less than 24 hours the ice would all disappear by sinking. You will observe by holding a piece up to the light that it is very porous, has a dark-colored appearance, a sure indication that it will not long remain. The wind was to southward. Consequently, if the ice moved, it would have to drift directly to windward, from the lay of the land, the outlet being only 10 miles wide to the northward. At daylight in the morning went aloft, looked over the beach, and no ice could be discovered. Both vessels got under way and sailed, with a strong fair wind going at the rate of 7 or 8 miles an hour. Saw no ice during our further passage. Now where did it go? I say it sank. And persons who contend that the theory of fields of ice sinking is false will please tell us, if it does not sink, what does become of it. On the passage, I noticed the skipper and Uncle Oliver were fitting a large lot of gear. I looked on a few minutes and observed to the shipper that I presumed he and Mr. Norton intended to catch all the fish during the cruise. Said he, "Oh, no, but let me tell you we do expect to catch 1/2 that comes on board the vessel." I replied that they would not if I had my health. Said he, "I wonder if you don't expect to be high hook?" I replied, "That is just what I do expect. If I cannot, will not go home in the vessel. Sooner will I work my passage on some other one." Said he, Then I rather guess we shall make a saving of grub, for if you keep your word, we shall have one less to provision, for I never was beat in my life." I told him he had never had me to fish against. "No," said he, "but I've had a blamed sight smarter man to try it on." He had the advantage of me by his buying the stern of the boat privilege, while I had to fish in the bows. But at the close of the season I let him in count 142 fish. "Now," said I, "Captain Fisher, I think you will have to victual me a little longer. I shall take the passage with you." It did not set well on his stomach. Uncle Oliver was behind me over 2,000, I having taken during the 6 weeks of fishing 13,000 fish to my line, which, with those of the rest of the crew, were salted and brought to Boston Green and were cured at Galloop's Island down the harbor. When we had completed the task, with the exception of about 80 quintal, as a party had chartered the brig for a West India voyage, the owners were exceeding anxious to get the balance dried and brought up to market. The captain was an owner also. He ordered all who could work to advantage to turn on to washing out. While thus engaged, I noticed that the heat from the sun was very oppressive. It was terribly hot. I remarked to the skipper that unless the fish already spread were taken care of, the heat would destroy them. As he paid no heed to my expression of opinion, I repeated the suggestion and told him they would surely become sunburnt. He only told me that I appeared to have a great deal to say about the fish. I told him that as I owned the largest portion of them, my self-interest made me speak. He said, "Let them burn and be hanged, for every fish must be washed today." The washing was continued to the end of the chapter. Towards night, went on shore to faggot or pile the fish. As we took them by the tail, it dropped off in our hands, and as we attempted to gather them by placing the hand under them, the napes would fall to the ground. They didn't amount to much. Often did I afterward fill a bushel basket with the burnt fish and exchange them with the farmers for a small pail of milk. What were not thus disposed of we left upon the island, not considering them worth gathering up. I told the skipper that he ought to be compelled to pay for them. I think so still. His reply was that he was not aware how hot the sun was. The balance of the cargo was taken to the city and sold, and after a 6 months' absence we returned to our homes. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of 80 Years Ashore and Afloat, or The Thrilling Adventures of Uncle Jethro by E. C. Cornell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Conclusion. And now, having wearied my listeners with the recital of some of the most important scenes in my checkered life, there is but little more to add. The sun of my declining years is sinking fast. The trembling limb and wrinkled brow tell me in words that is difficult to misinterpret that the glass of my mortal voyage has about run out. 70 has been numbered, and the 18th of July, 1873, will be 80 years since my birth. It is not strange that I sometimes feel to appropriate the words of the poet, "My days are gliding swiftly by, and I a pilgrim stranger." By and by it will be said of me, as of most of my childhood's companions, he is gone. But if prepared to meet the great change that awaits the family of earth, it is not particularly material at just what moment we are summoned. hoping to be reunited in a brighter world than this, I draw the narrative to a close. End of Chapter 28. Recording by Phyllis Vincelli. End of 80 Years Ashore and Afloat, or The Thrilling Adventures of Uncle Jethro, embracing the remarkable episodes in a life of toil and danger on land and sea by E. C. Cornell.